Good evening and welcome to the 10th podcast of the second season of The Moral Economy. I am one of your hosts, Andrew.
I'm another one of your hosts, Eddie.
I'm still an unemployed back scrubber, Navaz.
Well, then I'll be an underwater basket weaver, with emphasis on the underwater part. And I'm Chell.
On this podcast, we will be talking about democratic confederalism, but first we would like to pay tribute to Halim Dana.
Halim Denner was shot by a German police in the back on 30th June 1994 while he was putting up some pancards, pasting them on a wall in Hanover. That's a German city. This happened a little less than a year after Germany has forbidden PKK and all its activities. PKK is the leading organization for the Kurdish freedom movement. It's called Partiya Karkeran Kurdistan, that translates into Kurdish Workers' Party of Kurdistan. Previously, PKK was able to resume its activities, political activities in Germany as well as in Europe and all over the world. However, in 1993, Germany introduced a ban on PKK and all of its activities and all of its symbols. Halim Denner in Hanover on 30th June in 1994 with his friends on the streets wanted to protest this, and he wanted to put up the PKK's flag on a wall in Hanover. This was interrupted by the German police, who reacted very harshly, and one of the police officers targetedly shot him in the back, and he was dead at that instance. And on this last 30th of June, in Germany, all over Germany, there were rallies commemorating his memory and his legacy, because PKK is being criminalized to this day. The PKK ban is still active in Germany to this day, although there have been many calls made from several NGOs, several civil society organizations, several institutions to lift this ban. And maybe this can be taken as a call to lift that ban at this very moment where the Kurdish people are being massacred everywhere, wherever they are in large numbers, wherever they are politically active, and wherever they are asking for freedom, wherever they are demanding for their freedom. Halim Denner was a young person. Halim Denner was in a country where he wasn't actually supposed to be. Halim Denner was in a country where he wanted to be politically active in order to defend his people, his rights, his language, and his symbols. And for this reason, he was shot on the streets with cold blood by the German police, who got away with this murder. Like many other political murders all over the world, this was buried under, basically, and justice was not brought back upon him. And his legacy, Halim Denner's legacy, that PKK's, the ban on PKK must be lifted, that we must resist to this ban, is still here with us. And also in Hamburg, there was a rally in front of Rote on 30th June, like many other several major cities in Germany. And we would like to commemorate him also today with this podcast.
And in our commemoration of him, we would like to talk about democratic confederalism, which is the system that is being put in place in Rojava in Kurdistan. It is an alternative to the systems in Europe, the very oppressive systems, capitalism of the West. And we feel in the moral economy that democratic confederalism can be an actual alternative, because we see that it is actually working in Rojava as they are fighting against ISIS on one front and against Turkey on another front.
So democratic confederalism is today becoming more and more popular with increasing interest in the Kurdish freedom movement. But there is some background to this, and I would like to offer this right here, right now, using this opportunity. So the Kurdish freedom movement started in the 80s with the foundation of PKK as a freedom movement that had large support within its base. But PKK's main goal was to establish a Kurdish nation state. And this was then later realized in the late 90s by the leading figures of PKK and most of its supporters to be insufficient and also counterproductive for the very aims that PKK was founded for. That was basically the freedom for everybody living in the territories that they were active and fighting for. They realized that the goal of nation state is not something that can be reconciled with their own colonial experience, with the repression that they have lived themselves. A nation state is destined to oppress others, whatever it is called. If it's a Kurdish nation state, a Turkish nation state, a German nation state, an American nation state, that doesn't matter. Whenever this nation state has an identity, this identity will be the dominant one at the expense of all other identities existing within those territories. So PKK left this ideology, and its founding figures, more prominently Abdullah Öcalan, who is in prison now in Turkey, who is a political prisoner right now in Turkey, they offered an alternative. The alternative is commonly referred to as democratic confederalism. Democratic confederalism means a lot of things, but it can be brought down to three main principles. First is women's liberation. Kurdish society is extremely patriarchal, and women were not really on the forefront of not let alone the forefront of the resistance, but women were not even visible within the society, within the family. They will not be able to work because their husbands will not allow this. They will not be able to go out in the street, walk on the street freely. But with PKK and the women's liberation movement that emerged next to it, along with it, brought a lot of gains for the women living in Kurdistan. Today, the women in Kurdistan are at the forefront of the resistance and are basically leading the movement. We can see this also in Rojava, where YPJ has its autonomous organization alongside YPG. And today, all politically active Kurdish people agree that women's liberation is something that PKK cannot dispense with. The second one is ecology. Ecology is important not because we have to rescue the nature or we have to rescue the world, but basically because we have to rescue ourselves from nature. The democratic confederalism recognizes that people are living within the nature, not outside of it. That the life that, the free life, the ideal life that we would like to lead is not one that is separated from the nature itself. The third one is the communal life. Democratic confederalism recognizes that capitalism has been a destructive force for the human beings all over the world, and that capitalism dispenses with the communal life that has been existing throughout the human history. That capitalism separates human beings from each other. That capitalism is, in the end, something that cannot be reconciled with the ideal human life, with the pursuit of happiness. These three pillars, women's liberation, social ecology, and communal life, constitute democratic confederalism in its very core. Now I think we can discuss about these issues maybe more in depth, if anybody would like to take the stage.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, I guess make it a little thicker. Make the defining points that my comrade here just mentioned about democratic confederalism is that the women's liberation movement, social ecology, and just participatory democracy are all based off the idea that what we're trying to free ourselves from, if we can say that, is different forms of oppression. And Öcalan, if you guys are interested in reading more about, was very much inspired by another thinker, Murray Bookchin, who gets his roots from both the Marxist and the anarchist tradition. And according to his anthropology, oppression is rooted in the first instance, at least, of men's oppression towards women. And so if we want to cut away oppression, we first have to look at that relationship. If we start thinking about social ecology, science for many thinkers was man's attempt to oppress nature. So in this sense, we also have to think about the environment and our relationships with it, and stop seeing it so instrumentally. And so I guess a good book that I recommend for everyone to take a look at is Murray Bookchin's Social Ecology? Ecology of Freedom. Yeah. That's my 2 cents. Yeah.
I don't think it can be stressed too much how much these three pillars of democratic confederalism are actually interplay with one another. If we just look at what's happening nowadays, we are well aware that we have catastrophic climate change on our horizon due to our ruining of nature, and that there's also a world consensus that we need to do something about it. But because our communities are so oppressed, even though most people are actually for changing the way we interact with nature, and specifically getting rid of fossil fuels, we're not able to do this. We just had last year in November in Paris, we had the 21st COP conference, where they signed an agreement that is basically laughable, and the participation in that agreement by you, me, normal people was 0 to none, and in the fact that we couldn't participate, we basically passively saw how people, how our leaders, our so-called leaders, handed over our future to corporations and basically ruined our future.
And so just to add something else, yeah, that basically mass participation was shunned or not allowed in COP21. This goes in line, I think, with what an option that democratic confederalism offers us. It's that, according to the philosophy, it's not about, this kind of Marxist-Leninist approach where you just, attack the palace gates, looking to overthrow the state. That just doesn't work anymore. And so for in as far as strategy is concerned, it's about much more taking this kind of role of changing the very communities you're in, doing the small things in your community so that locally everyone could become much more participatory in their communities, in their own democracies. And by creating these small little spaces, we can hopefully, in the long run, contribute to a much bigger change in the social dimension. And I think that's of the utmost importance, because nowadays just the hegemony of the kind of logic that encompasses the world and the way that we see the world is so powerful that I think any kind of idea, any kind of utopic idea that we have seems almost impossible. But on the other hand, if we look at the small steps, the things that we could do in our local neighborhoods to contribute to a change, that makes it a lot easier and a lot more plausible and possible. Navaz, you want to say something?
Yeah. I was just wondering. I was just sort of reflecting on what we were talking about in terms of the 3 points that were mentioned: a reconfiguration of gender relations, right? A reconfiguration of our relationship with the environment, and a reconfiguration of our social, communal, political life. Now, as I see it, we have standard responses to these problems from contemporary Enlightenment theory. Let's say in the post-Enlightenment theory, we have feminism, we have ecology, and we have some sorts of communitarianism, right? Now, my question, because I don't know a lot about it, so my question would be, in what way does democratic confederalism have a different take on these positions in terms of gender relations, in terms of relationship with the environment, and in terms of relationship with the community at large? So what does it bring to the table that, let's say, feminism has not been able to answer, let's say that ecology has not been able to answer, let's say that differentiates from the standard communitarian position in the modern, let's say, liberal thought? Yeah, sure.
I have at least two. I think I could respond to two of these points. Firstly, with the Enlightenment and its relationship to nature, it's always been one of something that it feared. Nature was something; it was the unknown. It tried to understand it, and I think implicit in all Enlightenment thought, and then therefore scientific thought, was the idea that nature had to be conquered. It had to be understood, and therefore, if we understand it, we can take control of it because we feared it. And so changing this relationship, I see, is the seed of change in that outlook towards nature. Towards women, I see what democratic confederalism or social ecology is saying is that is the first instance of oppression. And so before we can do anything else, we have to change that, right? That is the first point of liberation. And through that freedom process, also man's relationship with themselves changes, right? Because we have certain ideas and roles gender roles that we have to play given our enlightenment heredity, right? Heritage, yeah. And for democratic participation, I think it's against this Enlightenment idea, which Marx is part of a tradition, so is anarchism, which says, no, we have to overthrow the state. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what democratic confederalism, social ecology want to say is that, no, that just doesn't work anymore. We can't look at it as, overthrowing the palace, the czar, the government. We have to do it locally. Mm-hmm. But seriously, that doesn't mean just, plant something in your backyard. No, it means participatory democracy.
if I may just add, since the Enlightenment and well before that, for thousands of years, we've had hierarchies, and human beings have always projected these hierarchies onto nature, onto the relationship with women, and also onto the relationship of in the community. And for instance, the starting with women, it's the man's castle, and the women is there to serve him. One sort of interesting thing is that actually our marriages in the West, they're based on what was used to be a feudal vow of fealty to the Lord of whatever region you're in. You would vow your fealty to that person and serve that person, and that is the role that women were always put into. Going to ecology, social ecology, we project our hierarchies onto the animals and the plants. We call them kingdoms, and then we have a strict hierarchy of what these kingdoms look like. And for instance, we have food chains, and we see that these food chains, we're at the top of the food chain. But if we really think about it, there is no food chain. There's only a food network, and we're just one part of this network. We will also all be decaying in the grave at one point, and food for worms. And the final one, and is communities. That's where hierarchies is probably most obvious. Is our communities nowadays are no more. Earlier, our communities might have been much more horizontal, but now we've lost a lot of our communities because we sort of subvert communities and the relations that people have to each other to a system where lots of people have, or some people have lots of money, lots of people have very little money, and we see this as just, and we see this as their merits, that they have this money because they deserved it. And that's based on our false understanding of evolution, which again ties into why all these things are tied together. We project our idea of hierarchy onto evolution, and then we take our idea of a hierarchical evolution of the survival of the fittest and apply it to our oppression of people.
But that doesn't have to be that way, right? There is responses to gender relations within feminist critiques. There is responses to a relationship with the nature in terms of the whole ecological movement. That has a different take on how we're supposed to relate ourselves to the environment. I take it, that there are problems in the way democracies function. But then again, democracy in itself is a liberating idea that, all men are equal, at least in terms of casting their votes, whatever, procedurally, right? That recognizes it, and it's put into institutions which could be problematic. Hopefully.
Okay, we're back.
Okay, so I think the problem lies in what you've just said about that all men are equal, and I think that's one of the main pillars of democratic confederalism, that we have to get through these struggles of always emphasizing the man. We have to think about the woman, because it's one of the main arguments of democratic confederalism, that the woman has to be liberated, and we can only do that if we do that from the bottom. And this is where democratic confederalism comes in, because we are trying to solve the problem from the base. And I think this doesn't take place in so many places right now, like in Rojava, where people are trying to solve their problems together in little groups rather than being on hierarchical levels and being, that's what I just wanted to say, basically.
Okay, well, Navas, coming back to your question about the value added of democratic confederalism, if I were to defend democratic confederalism, I would say that the value added has to do with the practice of democratic confederalism as a political ideology. And so it's true that we have, feminist theory and theory of communitarianism and the theory of ecology in the sort of post-Enlightenment tradition that you mentioned. But I think that democratic confederalism, by basing its very political ideology on these three pillars, puts these things into practice, and it has put them into practice, and it's being practiced now. Whereas if you look at sort of communism or anarchism, there have been attempts, but it's never succeeded. Whereas now we see, in a sense, perhaps you might even say that democratic confederalism is the natural evolution of this thinking, because now we have the chance of something succeeding where communism and anarchism in the past have failed. So value-added practice was my point. Yes.
Well, I'd say there's practice of feminism in a lot of ways, in terms of a lot of legal enactments. More recently in Germany, in terms of quotas for how many women have to be on leadership positions within institutions, businesses, whatsoever. That is just one example on top of my head. There is actions about ecology. There's ecology in practice in terms of the carbon trading that you can trade in the world. There is practice of communitarianism in terms of pension schemes. Again, that is a very communitarian practice. So I'd say there's other ways of practicing these ideas as well. But I understand, as far as I understand it, that what democratic confederalism is trying to tell us, that we do not need a state, a paternalistic state, for us to be able to emancipate women or to be able to reconfigure a relationship with the environment and with ourselves. So I am sympathetic to that argument insofar as that goes. But I would again, say that there's other arguments to that effect too. So I'm still questioning that what really are we trying to get out of democratic confederalism in that sense?
Yeah. What I want to say might or hopefully will satiate your curiosity, in the sense that the state level, kind of like how in the US the American justice system intrinsically maintains systemic racism, I think we can argue that the state logic that we have in the world institutionalizes inequality with women, a natural relationship, a relationship with nature that's oppressive. And so what I see democratic confederalism potentially do is that by having a relationship with our land, so creating spaces that are devoid of state, can potentially from the onset create relationships between the sexes, between nature, that don't have this bogged down oppressive logic that the state system gives us. Yeah, and that's my 2 cents to that.
So going back to what Nawaz just asked, what does democratic confederalism bring new to the table? Maybe I should give some more context to how it emerged, what kind of a problem it tries to solve. Democratic confederalism is a new answer to an old question. The old question was, how can the Kurdish people emancipate themselves under conditions of colonialism, under conditions of being separated from each other and divided by four different countries, which were themselves extensions of other colonial powers, who later on became colonial powers themselves, exercising their colonial powers over the Kurdish people. Then this question was answered with nationalism, basically, that the Kurds wanted to have their own nation state. And this was also realized to be the wrong answer, because as we are all familiar with the master and slave dialect, there are two options available for the slave. First, the slave can try to be like the master and oppress the others. That is one of the possible exits from their predicament. Another one is the revolutionary one, which is to demolish this dialect altogether, to demolish this master and slave relationship altogether, so that nobody is a master, so that nobody is a slave anymore. And this comes from the fact that the Kurdish society itself is not uniform. It's not only the Kurds living in those territories. There are many other cultural backgrounds to the people living there. There are Kurds, there are Arabs, there are Turks, there are Turkmens, there are Azerbaijanis, there are Iranis, Armenians, Assyrians, just to name the most well-known. And religion, in terms of religion, there are also a lot of different religious people who are living there. There are Christians, there are Jews, there are Muslims, there are Alevis. The different groups are basically endless, and that is not something that any emancipatory movement can ignore. These are concrete facts, and any movement who thinks of itself as liberatory, emancipatory, has to take into account the fact that their basic aim is human freedom, human emancipation, regardless of their identities. And democratic confederalism does not want to melt everybody in the same pot, does not want to give them the same identity. Democratic confederalism wants to encourage everybody to live their own identity to the fullest. And this by way of engaging in radical democracy at the very basis.
Yeah, so coming back to what you were talking about, Nawaz, and also building on what Eddie said, I would like to mention that when we take, for example, feminist practice, and we look at how it's been then institutionalized, we have to remember that, or ecological practice, environmental practice, and how that's been institutionalized. We have to remember that the institutions and the nation state and capitalism and all these things, they go into, they limit the scope of how these things can sort of be developed and be institutionalized, and the strength of democratic confederalism then is that it's no longer limited by these sort of traditional structures, and it can then experiment with this, with institutionalizing these theories in a different way, I guess.
If I could just add on to that point, I mean, you mentioned how there are actually these sort of different strains in our current society now. You know, we have feminist movements, we have communism, which also tried to overthrow the shackles of capitalism. We have all these different sort of movements, all these different sort of schools of thought. And I would see democratic confederalism as a convergence of all of these, and that is one of the new things about it. And not only is it a convergence, but if we look at all these movements, as Chell was saying, you know, they were constrained by capitalism, and in many ways that was because lots of these movements were sort of trying to use the tools of their masters in order to achieve their ends, and in doing so, they were always constraining themselves. And democratic confederalism is trying to actually create new tools in order to achieve its ends. And that starts with a radical transformation of how we see each other, how we relate to each other, but also how we relate to our environment. And I don't know, did anyone want to say anything? Closing remarks?
Those were the closing remarks.
Those were the closing remarks. Okay.
And one more thing, just to re-emphasize the point, which I mentioned earlier, then Cho mentioned again, which to me came about through this discussion, and I want to thank everyone for participating in this discussion, was the idea of that democratic confederalism with its relationship to the state, the idea that we need the space free from the state to rethink about these kind of things, because till now, yes, there are examples of feminism, yes, there are examples of environmentalism, but the state system bogs them down. And so instead of going through all the legislative hassle that we have to, by thinking about potential new spaces outside of the states, they create the opportunity, the new tools to fight these struggles. Yeah, that's something that I picked up, at least through this discussion, that I think is pretty darn good. Closing remarks, anyone?
Okay, well, seeing as that is this is the last podcast of our second season, we would like to emphasize that you should really share us. You should share these podcasts. You should find us in Twitter, at Moral Economicus. You should find us in Facebook, The Moral Economy.
And critique us, please.
And critique us. Stay critical.
Yep.
Stay critical.
Yeah.
Good night.
We're sick and tired of all your lies, your unwillingness to compromise. So we'll take it into our own hands. Educate ourselves and take a stand. We're gonna occupy your street, your house, your bank accounts, your everything, yes, everything. Oh, we're here to occupy. I know we feel it's time we occupy. Hey, yeah. I reckon it's a revolution. When it's all said and done, you will find no place to hide, nowhere to run. Heaven should know.